In the autumn of 1968, in the rugged hills of southern Vermont, a prevailing delusion had infected the local agricultural community. The traditional apple farmers believed that the soil was entirely exhausted, convinced that the future of the mountain economy lay exclusively in selling out to out-of-state recreational developers who wanted to build massive paved ski resorts. Arthur Vance stood entirely apart from this modern frenzy, working his remote 40-acre orchard with a quiet, stubborn rhythm. He was 70 years old, his hands deeply calloused from a lifetime of pulling heavy yields from the rocky, unforgiving New England soil. Standing beneath the sprawling canopy of a century-old apple tree, Arthur pulled a worn, bone-handled pruning saw from his leather belt. The brass rivets on the handle were polished smooth by decades of friction, and the carbon steel blade was filed to a razor edge. Arthur reached up and hooked the blade over a dead, crowding branch, pulling down with a smooth, practiced stroke that sent a shower of sawdust drifting into the cool autumn air. The local market was currently saturated with mass-produced, uniformly red apples that tasted like damp cardboard, driving wholesale prices down to a miserable $1.20 a bushel. Most of Arthur's neighbors had already taken the buyout money, willingly letting bulldozers tear up generations of deep-rooted agricultural history to make way for concrete foundations and chairlift pylons. Arthur, however, knew exactly what he possessed in these ancient gnarled trees. The wood was dense, the root systems plunged 30 feet into the limestone bedrock, and the fruit they bore was complex, tart, and uniquely adapted to the harsh microclimate. He stepped back to inspect the clean cut he had just made with his saw, satisfied that the canopy would now receive adequate sunlight for the spring bloom. A heavy dual-axle flatbed truck suddenly rumbled past the lower boundary of his property, carrying a massive load of structural steel. The invasion had already begun, but Arthur simply wiped the sawdust from his brow, slid the bone-handled saw back into its leather sheath, and moved to the next tree. The following morning, Arthur drove his rattling 1954 Ford pickup truck down the winding mountain road and into the valley town to purchase a winter supply of copper sulfate fungicide. The local hardware store shared a building with the town diner, a bustling hub where the scent of black coffee mixed with the sharp smell of fertilizer and motor oil. As Arthur pushed through the heavy wooden door, the lively chatter in the room noticeably dimmed. Sitting at the largest corner table, surrounded by spread-out architectural blueprints and a group of sycophantic local officials, was Richard Sterling. Richard was a wealthy, aggressive real estate developer from out of state, wearing a crisp cashmere sweater and a gold watch that caught the diner's fluorescent lighting. He had built a lucrative empire by buying up distressed agricultural land, clearing it, and constructing high-end seasonal resorts for wealthy tourists. "Well, if it isn't the last stubborn mule in the valley," Richard called out loudly, making sure his voice carried over the clattering dishes. He stood up, leaving his blueprints, and walked over to the main counter where Arthur was waiting to pay. "I drove past your little antique collection this morning, Vance. Those trees look like they're ready to fall over and die of old age, much like their owner." Martha Higgins, the diner's owner, stopped wiping the counter, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. Samuel Miller, the local postman who was drinking his morning coffee, shrank back in his booth, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden hostility. Richard leaned casually against the counter, blocking Arthur's access to the register. "I sent you a final cash offer yesterday, Arthur, well above market rate for dead agricultural land," Richard sneered, tapping his manicured finger on the wood. "Sell me the 40 acres so I can connect the north and south ski slopes, or you're going to find yourself entirely boxed in by progress. You have no leverage, old man." Arthur calmly pulled a worn leather wallet from his denim jacket. He did not look at Richard's mocking face, nor did he respond to the threat of being boxed in. "Just need 4 bags of the copper sulfate, Martha, and you can put it on my usual tab," Arthur said quietly, his voice steady and perfectly polite. He tipped his canvas hat respectfully to Martha and Samuel. stepped carefully around the wealthy developer as if he were merely an obstacle in the road, and walked out into the crisp morning air. Rather than engaging in a shouting match with the developer, Arthur returned directly to the quiet sanctuary of his orchard to enact his contrarian decision. He refused to adopt the chemical-heavy, high-yield farming methods the county extension office pushed, instead relying on meticulous, localized care. He mixed his copper sulfate in an old wooden barrel, stirring the blue liquid with a long hickory stick until the ratio was perfectly balanced to protect the bark without poisoning the deep soil microbiome. While Richard Sterling spent his days aggressively manipulating town zoning boards and screaming at contractors, Arthur spent his days on his knees in the dirt. He carefully applied a thick layer of organic compost around the base of the oldest trees, ensuring their roots would be insulated against the coming winter freezes. Meanwhile, Richard's arrogance demanded immediate, crushing action to punish Arthur's public dismissal. Since Arthur refused to sell the 40 acres, Richard drove to the county courthouse and utilized his vast capital to legally purchase the narrow, 2-mile dirt road that served as the only vehicular access to Arthur's farm. The road had been informally shared for generations, but because it technically cut through a parcel Richard had just acquired, he was legally entitled to privatize it. Richard did not just buy the road, he immediately hired a crew to erect a heavy steel gate across the entrance. The developer stood by the new gate, watching his workers weld the thick iron hinges, his chest puffed out with the satisfaction of a man who believed power could solve any problem. He had successfully cut off the farmer's access to the outside world, effectively turning Arthur's property into a landlocked island just as the heavy autumn harvest was approaching. The steel gate changed the fundamental logistics of Arthur's daily existence, forcing him into a grueling routine. Because his pickup truck was now trapped inside the property line, Arthur had to hike 2 miles down the steep, rocky hillside every time he needed supplies, carrying heavy sacks of feed and fertilizer on his aging back. He worked in complete silence, the only sound in the orchard being the rhythmic rasp of his bone-handled pruning saw as he continued to shape the dense canopies. He did not complain to the town council, nor did he hire a lawyer to fight the closure of the road. He simply adapted his labor to the new brutal parameters Richard had set. When a hydraulic line on his ancient tractor blew out, Arthur spent 2 days walking to town and back, carrying a 50-pound jug of hydraulic fluid and a coil of high-pressure hose through the dense pine forest. Richard, infuriated that the road closure had not broken the old man's spirit, decided to escalate his psychological warfare. He ordered his construction crews to drag a massive, diesel-powered rock crusher to the exact edge of Arthur's property line. The machine was a monstrous piece of heavy equipment, and Richard instructed the operator to run it at maximum RPMs starting at 6 in the morning, shattering the peaceful mountain silence. Richard drove up to the steel gate in his luxury sedan, leaning against the hood to watch the dust and diesel smoke drift over Arthur's pristine apple trees. He nailed a large, bright yellow private property, "Violators will be prosecuted" sign directly to the center of the steel gate, making sure the bold black letters faced Arthur's driveway. Arthur simply paused his work, wiped the sweat and diesel soot from his eyes, and went back to sawing through a thick, dead branch, refusing to give the developer the satisfaction of a reaction. As the harsh Vermont winter of 1968 finally closed in, the mountain transformed into a frozen, unforgiving landscape. Arthur's struggles multiplied exponentially, as he was now forced to drag a heavy wooden sled through 3 feet of snow just to transport firewood from the lower timberline to his small farmhouse. The cold was bitter, regularly dropping below zero, and his joints ached with a deep, persistent fire that made every swing of his splitting maul an agonizing effort. Despite the physical toll, he faithfully patrolled his orchard every morning, brushing the heavy snow accumulation off the fragile branches of the ancient trees to prevent them from snapping under the weight. The isolation was profound, but the quiet dignity of the work kept his mind sharp and his spirit stubbornly unbroken. Down in the valley, Richard Sterling was executing his grand vision with theatrical flair. He hosted a massive, heavily publicized, groundbreaking ceremony for his new Sterling Peaks ski resort, inviting investors from New York and Boston to drink imported champagne in a heated, transparent tent. The tent was deliberately erected on a high ridge that looked directly down upon Arthur's snow-covered, landlocked farm, framing the old man's struggle as a rustic backdrop to Richard's triumph. Richard stood at a podium with a silver-plated shovel, loudly boasting into a microphone about how his resort would conquer the mountain and usher in a new era of limitless wealth. Fireworks were launched into the freezing night sky, their explosive booms echoing through the valley and startling the local wildlife. Arthur sat alone on his porch, a heavy wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching the colorful explosions reflect off the snow, while he slowly sharpened the blade of his pruning saw with a whetstone. When the heavy snows finally melted in the late spring of 1969, something remarkable shifted quietly beneath the surface of Arthur's orchard. The trees burst into a brilliant, shocking display of white and pink blossoms, a bloom so incredibly dense and vibrant that it looked like a second snowfall had blanketed the 40 acres. A traveling botanist from the State University, who was mapping old agricultural sites, happened to hike up the treacherous back trails and stumbled upon the hidden orchard. The academic took a few leaf samples and carefully studied the structural geometry of the blossoms, his eyes widening behind his thick glasses. He rushed back to his laboratory, running the physical data against historical agricultural archives, and made a staggering discovery. Arthur's trees were not just old, they were a completely pure, unmutated stand of the Green Mountain Keeper, a legendary heritage apple variety that the scientific community had officially declared extinct in 1912. The university immediately recognized the immense genetic value of the orchard, realizing that these deep-rooted survivors possessed a natural resistance to modern blights that had been entirely bred out of commercial trees. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling was growing dangerously overconfident, intoxicated by the rapid construction of his ski lodges. He leveraged his company's entire remaining capital, taking out massive, high-interest secondary loans to build a state-of-the-art gondola system. Richard assumed that the coming winter would bring historic snowfalls and millions in tourist revenue, blinding himself completely to the financial precipice he was enthusiastically sprinting toward. The true crisis arrived in the autumn of 1969, just as the rare apples ripened into heavy, flawless spheres of dark, mottled green. Arthur had successfully harvested over 3,000 bushels of the precious fruit, carefully packing them into wooden crates that filled his barn to the absolute rafters. However, Richard Sterling launched his most devastating institutional attack yet, weaponizing his construction permits to fundamentally alter the landscape. Without warning, Richard's massive excavators tore into the side of the mountain, completely bulldozing the only dirt road to build a massive 30-foot concrete retaining wall for his new parking lot. The road was not just blocked by a gate anymore, it was physically gone, leaving a sheer, impassable cliff face between Arthur's farm and the valley below. Thomas Cobb, Arthur's lifelong friend, had hiked up the back trails carrying a thermos of coffee, arriving just in time to see the excavators tear away the last stretch of earth. Thomas stood at the edge of the newly formed cliff, staring down at the concrete mixers, his face pale and stricken with overwhelming defeat. He turned to Arthur, who was holding his old pruning saw, his hands stained with the sap of the harvest. "It's over, Arthur. He actually did it." Thomas voiced the despair out loud, his voice cracking with emotion. "You have 3,000 bushels of the rarest apples in the state sitting in that barn, and you can't get a single crate down the mountain before they rot. He's won, Arthur. He's trapped you completely." It appeared to every observer that the developer's brutal siege had finally, irreversibly crushed the old farmer. The winter of 1969 to 1970 was supposed to be the grand, triumphant opening of the Sterling Peaks ski resort, but the atmosphere had a different plan. A bizarre, unprecedented shift in the climate pattern trapped a massive high-pressure system over New England, resulting in an unseasonably warm, entirely snowless winter. Instead of the pristine white powder Richard had aggressively banked his entire fortune on, the mountain received months of relentless, dismal winter rain that turned his expensive ski slopes into deeply rutted mud pits. Richard's grand resort sat entirely empty, the high-speed chairlifts swinging uselessly in the damp wind, while his investors furiously demanded the returns he had explicitly promised. The bank officers, realizing the catastrophic failure of the season, initiated aggressive foreclosure protocols calling in the massive, over-leveraged loans Richard had hastily signed. Up on the landlocked farm, the university botanists had not forgotten the priceless genetic treasure sitting in Arthur's barn. Because Richard had arrogantly destroyed the road, the university realized they could not use trucks to transport the delicate seeds and live cuttings they desperately needed for their preservation grant. They bypassed the developer's blockade entirely, hiring a private cargo helicopter that loudly chopped through the crisp mountain air and landed gracefully in Arthur's upper pasture. The scientists emerged with steel lockboxes and a legally binding contract backed by a massive federal agricultural endowment. By cutting off the road to prevent Arthur from selling apples locally for pennies, Richard's own action had inadvertently forced the farmer into the arms of a high-paying national institution. The fatal flaw of Richard's greed had blinded him to the hidden value of the land, triggering his own spectacular downfall. By the spring of 1970, the financial hemorrhage had completely drained Richard Sterling's empire, forcing his sprawling mountain property into an emergency public auction. The event was held in the drafty hall of the county courthouse, packed with curious locals, skeptical investors, and the nervous bank executives who were desperately trying to recoup their massive losses. Richard sat slumped in the front row, his cashmere sweater replaced by a wrinkled suit, his face completely devoid of the arrogant smirk that had once terrorized the valley. The auctioneer began the bidding for the land surrounding the old orchard, including the newly built resort infrastructure and the deeply excavated retaining walls. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room opened, and Arthur Vance walked in, moving with a slow, deliberate cadence. Martha Higgins and Samuel Miller, the same witnesses who had watched Richard humiliate Arthur in the diner years ago, turned in their seats, their eyes wide as the old farmer approached the bidding floor. When the auctioneer asked for an opening bid, Arthur calmly raised his numbered paddle, utilizing the massive, entirely liquid capital he had acquired from the federal botanical grant. Every time a corporate investor tried to counter, Arthur simply raised his paddle again, his face a mask of absolute, unshakable calm. Richard watched in pale, sickening horror as the old man he had relentlessly mocked systematically outbid every corporation in the room, purchasing the developer's ruined empire with the very money generated by the trees Richard had called dead wood. The poetic justice was absolute, witnessed by the entire community. In the years that followed, Arthur Vance used his newly acquired heavy machinery to tear down the concrete retaining wall, restoring the old dirt road and opening the mountain back up to the valley. He systematically dismantled the sterile ski lodges, salvaging the steel and timber to construct a massive state-of-the-art agricultural research center dedicated to heritage crop preservation. Richard Sterling quietly left the state, his reputation shattered, and his wealth evaporated, becoming a cautionary tale whispered among greedy developers. The local community, witnessing the incredible triumph of patience and deep knowledge, radically shifted their perspective, turning away from fast corporate money to embrace the enduring value of their own land. Inside the main hall of the new research center, surrounded by glass enclosures, growing the next generation of Green Mountain Keeper saplings, a small glass display case was mounted prominently on the oak-paneled wall. Inside the case rested the old bone-handled pruning saw. It was retired from daily use, but its meaning had profoundly transformed for everyone who walked through those doors. The saw was no longer just a humble tool of a stubborn old man. It stood as a permanent, silent symbol of endurance, proving that those who carefully tend to the roots will always outlast those who merely try to pave over them.